we waste land. Like, we're a big country and we have lots of land. But to be honest, a lot of that land is permafrost in the Canadian Shield. Like, we really shouldn't be so wasteful with our land. The truth of the matter is building this way is cheaper, significantly cheaper. It's cheaper to build to begin with, but it's significantly, like orders of magnitude cheaper in the long run.
Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Cara Stern.
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
And today we're talking to internet celebrity Jason Slaughter of the popular YouTube channel Not Just Bikes about how we can make Canadian cities better for the young urban middle class and what we should and should not learn from the Netherlands.
But before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
For those of you that don't know Jason, he grew up in London, Ontario, a place he describes as both fake London and a car-dependent hellscape, where he was an elementary school classmate and a fierce road hockey component of my co-host Mike. He now lives in the Netherlands and he runs the YouTube channel Not Just Bikes, which gives stories of great urban planning and urban experiences from the Netherlands and beyond. There are a lot of reasons why Dutch cities are so great. It's not just bikes. So what makes Dutch cities so great, and how did they become so great?
Well, I've actually got a great YouTube channel you can watch about that. It's called Not Just Bikes. But I guess the kind of long and the short of it is that Dutch cities in general are designed around the idea that you can get around without a car by walking, cycling, and public transit. And that is like kind of a fundamental thing. There are also cities that are designed for all ages and all abilities. So it's just as easy for a kid to cycle to elementary school as it is for an 88-year-old grandmother to cycle to the grocery store. And I think there's a lot of aspects to that, which is why I've been able to have an entire YouTube channel about that subject for the last 5 years.
Is it mostly about the cycling?
No, it's actually not just bikes. I think one of the reasons I called the channel that, there's lots of reasons why I called the channel that, but I think cycling is one of these things that people often think about when they think about Dutch cities, because the cycling is very prominent. It is interesting, though, to look at the history, let's say for Amsterdam, where I happen to live. When you look back in, like, I don't know, 50s, 60s, 70s, they were very much building things to be car friendly. And they were running into all of the problems that a city does when they try to put everybody in cars. Suddenly there isn't enough space and there's lots of traffic and there's problems with parking and all of these kind of things. And the Dutch in the 70s, spurred on by the oil crisis, as well as just a lot of kids getting killed by cars, decided to make a change. But what I think is interesting is that even Amsterdam wasn't trying to make a bike-friendly city. They were just trying to make a city that was safe for children, a city where people could get around and in like by walking, a city that was for all people of all ages, whether they were able-bodied or disabled, and in doing so, and ended up making a city where cycling works very well. And it wasn't kind of until the late 80s, early 90s before they were like, maybe we should actually be building some bicycle infrastructure. So I think it really is about building a city that is just a better place to live. And cycling, I find, is not a goal. It should not be a goal of your city. You should not be making a city to be a cycling city. But cycling is a good metric by which you know that you're being successful.
So there's this tendency among North American urbanists to look at the changes the Netherlands made, starting in the 70s, as you said, those changes around roads and transit and all those things that you mentioned. And those urbanists think like, hey, like these Dutch guys wrote the playbook on how to create a great city. So all we need to do is follow it and our cities can be great too. But as someone who's watched a lot of your videos, listened to your podcast, you and I have these discussions, I get the sense from you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't think that, say, like London, Ontario, if they just tried to emulate Rotterdam or Eindhoven or some other city in the Netherlands, that's going to work. So, have I got that right? And why is that?
was about, ultimately my channel was why we moved to the Netherlands permanently. And that was the first year of the channel. It was all of the reasons why we prefer living here than Canada. That's why we moved our family here permanently. And I genuinely think that Dutch cities are better places to live than Canadian cities, broadly speaking. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done what we did. We would have just moved somewhere else in Canada. The end goal could be something like a Dutch city. I think the mistake that people make is just trying to jump to that. And I think this can be explained a little bit. If I get asked sometimes by people, I'm like, well, what can I do to fix my city? They'll say it in that terms. Things need to be fixed. These Canadian cities were walkable. 100 years ago, they were all walkable. They all had train stations. They all had trams. You could walk to do everything you needed to do. That was the reality in Canada. And people love to spout the myth that, Canadian cities aren't old or are all designed for the car, but that's wrong. And they were often bulldozed. A lot of that stuff was taken out. The trolleys were taken out. The train stations were taken out. We see this all over Canada. And I think that's the trick, right? If I were to tell a German, like, how should I fix my city? There's various things that I would tell that person, but not an awful lot of it would be relevant to North America. I mean, there's some basic stuff. If there's a community engagement meeting that your urban planning department is running, go to it. Join your local advocacy group. Like, these are the two obvious things that everybody everywhere should do if they want to improve their city. But beyond that, what I would tell that German person would be a variety of things that they could do to make their city better. But it would really kind of boil down to you really, really need to reduce car usage. If a German city got rid of 75% of their cars and took that space and put it into parks and walking, cycling, public transit infrastructure, German cities would basically be better. If you went to a Canadian city, if you went to London, Ontario, and got rid of 75% of the cars, people would literally starve to death. Like, they wouldn't be able to get to work. They wouldn't be able to go to the grocery store. Like, that's not the same. That's insane to do there, right? And I think that fundamentally shows the difference, because I think there is a fundamental difference between a city that still has its urban fabric, but just has some issues with that. Too much parking, too many cars, those kind of things, versus a city that was bulldozed and then sprawling suburbs were built for decades around it. And I think those are two very, very different things.
In some ways, Netherlands kind of feels like a weird place to be trying to emulate, because there's things about it that are just so different from our Canadian cities. And like, for example, the biggest thing in my mind is the growth. Like, we just have way more growth, and I don't know that it's sustainable, or I don't know that it's cost effective, at least, to build homes for people in a way that is as pedestrianized and walkable as what you would see in places like Amsterdam. And I know that there's things that they can do to make it better, but it is quite different. And then there's also things like, I think about how the cycling infrastructure and the pedestrian infrastructure, like, that's supposed to be really good in the Netherlands. So I'm thinking, okay, let's emulate there. And then I think about something like transit. Like, we could look at other places like in Japan that are really good for transit, I think are much better than what the Netherlands is, as far as I know. Like, should we be trying to take bits of pieces of different places, or is the Netherlands like a good model for us?
Push back a little bit when you talk about like the affordability to build like they do in the Netherlands. Like, it is more affordable to build more walkable, but there are things barriers we put in place in Canada and subsidies we put in place that make that less affordable. So I think that's probably not a valid part of this. But at the same time, I think one of the issues that I see when people are trying to emulate what the Netherlands has done is that they completely fail to understand the context. There's lots of dumb excuses that I hear that, it's flat, or it doesn't have big bad winters, or this is all nonsense. This is stuff that's a distraction, because you can go through every one of those examples. People cycle in the mountains of Switzerland. People cycle in Oulu in Finland, where 80% of the population cycles, even though it gets colder than almost any city in Canada.
Your video on that's great and very eye-opening.
Yeah, I mean, that's why Canadians can't cycle in the winter, but Finnish people can. And I think those things are the nonsense excuses, and I'm really, really tired of hearing about them. I have absolutely zero patience for them, because they're easily disproven. But I think what is often done is the context is forgotten. And this is why, actually, I think, and I'll get to this maybe, why there are other places that are better for North American cities to emulate. Such I've talked about Copenhagen, for example, is probably a better example to use because it's more similar to the situation in Canada than the Netherlands is. But I have seen it happen where, even very well-meaning, intelligent, educated transportation planners, urban planners look at something in the Netherlands and then try to implement it in Canada or in the US, and with kind of comically bad results.
What are some examples that you've seen people try to emulate that haven't been able to work?
Yeah, so I think it is important that you look at a city holistically. I find that a lot of the time in North America, we tend to look at things like, let's say, bike lanes, but the same could be said for transit or anything else. We look at it very much like at a street level. Like, for example, I was on the radio in CBC London after a video I made about Wonderland Road, because they wanted to Wonderland Road's full of traffic and it needs to be expanded from 4 lanes to 6, they say, which is insane because
One more
a
lane.
city the size of London, Ontario should have no 6-lane roads. It's absolutely ludicrous. People should be looking at that and saying, what the hell is wrong with you? We don't need 6-lane roads. But, instead they say, what is wrong with you? We can't have an LRT. But anyway, so I was interviewed with them and they said, oh, well, if you don't think that this is the right solution for Wonderland Road, though, what fix would you put in place for Wonderland Road? And I think this is often the way it's looked at. It's looked at kind of this street by street basis. It's not looked at holistically at all. And so they'll look at this and say, well, okay, yeah, Wonderland Road is full of cars. But what are you going to do about it? Because you can't just fix Wonderland Road. You can't just come in and take a 5-lane strode through the center of the city with a bunch of big box stores on it, stick some bike lanes on it and say, yep, job done. And I see this done all the time, where they'll look at a street design from the Netherlands. They'll come in and say, okay, well, we're redesigning the street, so let's do it the way that the best practices do it. This is a good idea, right? But then they'll just slap it down. But then it's this block out of context of the rest of the city. And you get the situation where it's like, well, nobody's using the bike lanes. Well, yeah, where are they going to go? How do they get there? It doesn't go to their homes. It doesn't go to like when they get to the shop, they have to cross an acre and a half of parking before they get there. Of course, nobody's going to bike in this place.
So where do you start then?
Yeah, so I think the trick is, first of all, you need to start looking at some examples that are relevant in the context of what you have. And again, I think street design is a big portion of this. I've joked before that if you just redesigned your street guidelines to be something like Copenhagen, wait 30 years, your city's fixed. But there is certainly an element of that. Streets need to be redesigned every 30 years. So you really should have better guidelines in place right now, because we should be building safer streets, better streets, wider sidewalks. Protected bike lanes should be the norm. Just like in Canada, I know if you look at some neighborhoods from, say, the 60s, they don't have sidewalks. They're built without sidewalks at all. Even the big arterial roads are built without sidewalks. Since then, we've changed things in Canada. You cannot build a neighborhood without sidewalks anymore. This is just a thing we realized that was really dumb. Why did we do that? Let's change the regulations so that every new street has sidewalks. But also, every time a street is rebuilt, because streets need to be rebuilt every 30 years. And you'll see this happen all the time in Canada. There'll be some road, some street. It needs to get redesigned. It needs to get rebuilt because it's been 30 years and the road bed's all destroyed and it all needs to be ripped up and done again. This is a normal thing that happens with infrastructure. And then it gets rebuilt and sidewalks are there. We need to start building it to say we also need to put bike lanes there. We also need to put transit lanes in. These, definitely that is a piece of it. But fundamentally, what Canada needs to do, and the United States certainly as well, is better land use. Because fundamentally, that's the piece that we're missing when it comes to cities in Canada. We waste land. We're a big country and we have lots of land. But to be honest, a lot of that land is permafrost in the Canadian Shield. We really shouldn't be so wasteful with our land, or it's valuable farmland. You don't want to look up the numbers of hectares of good arable farmland that are destroyed every single year in Canada to build single family homes. It's awful. It's absolutely awful. But you'll see this sometimes, certainly in the United States, but you see it in Canada too, where you'll sometimes be driving into the city and there'll be some old crappy strip mall. and like there's like one tenant left in it, right? And otherwise it's like empty. It's garbage. Nobody would want to be there. You drive another 5 minutes out of the city and there's a new shiny big box store with a bunch of like stores that are, there's the new Best Buy and the new whatever and the new Costco. And it's like, what are we doing? Why are we building this new stuff on the periphery when we've got land that is underutilized? And we very often do this in Canadian cities.
So, and I like you and I really tend to have a Gen X perspective here. We're very good at going, okay, like this is crap and this is crap and this is crap and this is crap. And we've been doing, and Cara, like we've been doing this since the 80s. So this is kind of nothing new for us. But is there anywhere that you would point to in North America going, you know what, these guys are, at least on the right path? Or is there any kind of optimism that you see coming out of North America?
Yeah, there are certainly some cities that are doing it better than others, as well as some neighborhoods too. Like even if you look at, for example, Markham in the suburbs of Toronto, they have a neighborhood there called Cornell, which if you're in the neighborhood, if you're nearby, go there. It's really interesting. It's a traditionally designed, what they call new urbanist neighborhood, and it's great. It looks really, really nice, and it's new. And we have built things like that in Canada every once in a while, although it always ends up being some weird one-off project where a whole bunch of red tape needed to be worked through before it was legal to build and everything. But we are doing that. There also are some cities that are doing better than others. I mean, we see some good changes happening in Toronto, but Montreal is an example as well, where they are building new transit like the REM, and they're putting a lot of bike lanes in, and they're generally making the city better. They're infilling, these old like abandoned warehouses, and they're making them into nicer neighborhoods. So it is possible to look to North America to see projects here and there that are being done. I think one of my issues with it is that it really does tend to be a one-off. It's kind of like this neighborhood here, that neighborhood there, as opposed to this, like, we're going to do this across the whole city.
At least we've seen some big changes since the pandemic. I know that like Toronto, for example, has so many more bike lanes than they did. Like there's so many places that in Toronto that I would never have ever considered riding my bike. And now I'm like, oh, this is so weird. I feel so safe here. I don't understand it. It moved fairly quickly. So I think that's why like I keep having this optimism that Mike doesn't seem to have, that things are going to get better in like a realistic part, like timeline. Like I keep thinking that it is possible that at some point in my life, we don't have to just, campaign to fix the traffic rules and then wait 30 years. I'm like, can't they get better faster?
Absolutely, they can. It's really an issue of money. Actually, it's not even money. It's mostly political will, because building it this way is cheaper. There are times when you see these like crazy bike lane projects that cost millions per kilometer and stuff, but guaranteed every single time it's because they've rolled in a bunch of other crap in there, like some extra new surfacing for the roads and new water pipes or something like that that's been thrown in and just called part of the cycling budget. The truth of the matter is building this way is cheaper, significantly cheaper. It's cheaper to build to begin with, but it's significantly, like orders of magnitude cheaper in the long run, like to sustain that neighborhood decades into the future. And this is what cities are realizing. There's a lot of talk about, there's still this stupid political issue about bike lanes being a wedge issue in politics, and it's so dumb. But you'll see, and I think the best example of this was John Tory in Toronto. You'll see that within politics, the people who actually know what's going on, they actually realize this stuff is cheaper, and they know that they've got budget issues. And this isn't talked about very often in Canada at all. I know the nonprofit organization Strong Towns in the US is really trying to highlight this, but this stuff is cheaper. So you see, like even a conservative politician like John Tory, who was very much into the bike lanes and stuff, and people think, oh, he's just pandering to the voters in Toronto. But no, I think he literally looked at the numbers and said, yeah, we really better be doing things this way. Like this is legitimately a better way to build. And so it can be done that way. The issue is political will, because if you look at something like Toronto, where one of the things I was involved with when I was still an advocate was the Gardiner Expressway rebuild. So the Gardiner Expressway is a highway that goes through Toronto. A lot of people forget that a lot of people's neighborhoods and homes were bulldozed in order to build it. Like, a lot of people were forcibly removed in order to build this highway. And all it does is funnel insane amounts of traffic into downtown Toronto. And it's the source of a major source of traffic for downtown Toronto. But then when you look at it, when you look at the statistics, I don't have it in front of me. It's been many years, but it was around something like 8% of morning commuters come in via the Gardiner Expressway in Toronto, which is nothing. Like, it's nothing. There were more people that came into downtown Toronto by walking and cycling, and way more by TTC and GO trains. Like, it's not even comparable. And yet, the highway was crumbling because all of the infrastructure needs to be replaced eventually. And it was built in the 1960s, late 50s and 60s. And it was crumbling and needed to be rebuilt. And the city was going back and forth on this and eventually decided to rebuild it at a cost of $5 billion. Like, it's absurd. It's absolutely absurd that went through, because could you imagine if the city spent $5 billion on bike lanes? Like, there would be like 6-meter, like, heated covered bike lanes, solar powered throughout the entire city for $5 billion. Or if that $5 billion had gone into transit or anything else.
I mean, transit, we are spending a lot. We have a $30 billion Ontario line plan, which I'm like, how is it even spending that much? Like, I always hear about how we could build so much more with that money if we just did it like efficiently. But I think there's something about people feel like the cycling is a luxury versus they feel like the Gardiner is, people need this. No one's going on the Gardiner for fun, but they take bike rides for fun. So like, we really just need it for people to actually get to work. That's how people feel, whether or not it's true. Do you think that that's something, like, is that a cultural thing or that can be changed?
Yeah, that's a cultural thing that can be changed for sure. Absolutely. I saw that change even while I was in Toronto. Toronto used to be a place where only, middle-aged men in Lycra would be cycling around at high speed. And nobody else in their right mind would be cycling because it was just too dangerous. But now you go to Toronto and you see families with kids on the back and cargo bikes and stuff, bringing their kids to daycare, kids on their own cycling around, older people cycling. That's actually one of these things that's quite interesting about the Netherlands, that everybody cycles here. It doesn't matter. Like, you see 5-year-olds cycling on their own. You also see literal, like, 85-year-olds cycling around, perfectly normal. Because it's just another form of transportation. And I think that does absolutely change. I've seen that changing in cities all over the world. It really is one of these things where it just has to be made safe. It has to be made safe and it has to be made practical. And as soon as it is, people will use it. There's a good example of this in Toronto along the waterfront, Queen's Quay. They built this bi-directional bicycle path. It's more narrow than I'd like it to be, but it's pretty decent infrastructure, certainly for Canada. And when the city was planning it, they planned it as a recreational trail. And if I remember correctly, I'm sure you can look up the numbers, it was something along the lines of they were expecting, 200 people a day to use it, mostly on the weekends. And when they opened it, over 1,000 people per day were using it, mostly on the weekdays, like within weeks of it opening. They completely missed the fact that there was all of this pent-up demand that people had to ride a bicycle, to get to work, to get to school, to go to the grocery store, to do any number of other things. And they completely missed it. And so the infrastructure was built as this like nice meandering path that goes along the waterfront. And meanwhile, people were like, no, we actually just want to use this to get to work. And this is the fundamental thing. Traffic in Toronto is atrocious. It's really, really bad. But as I say over and over and over again, every single chance I get, the only solution to car traffic is viable alternatives to driving. And when you give people viable alternatives, whether that's walking, whether that's cycling, whether that's public transit, some people will take it. Doesn't mean everybody's going to take it. People drive in the Netherlands, of course. That's fine. But there are other alternatives. And many times those alternatives are better. And when those alternatives are better, they're cheaper, they're faster, people will take them.
I'm grateful for your channel because I think that a lot of people who are working to kind of change that culture, a lot of them started by watching your videos and then they go, oh, things could be different. And it kind of gets them into, maybe they end up in different areas of pushing for change. But I think that it's a lot of people's first step into urbanism. So appreciate what you do. And thank you so much for joining us to talk about this.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Jason. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for watching and listening, and thanks as always to our producer, Meredith Martin.
And if you have any thoughts or questions or are an elementary school classmate of mine who would like to be on the show, please send us an email to missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com.
And we'll see you next time.